Look at a map of Southeast Asia, Indonesia, Malaysia, Borneo, Java, a scattering of thousands of green islands across a turquoise sea. Now, for a moment, erase the water. Pull it back, the way the ice ages once did. What you see is not an archipelago. It is a continent, twice the size of India, tropical, forested, threaded by rivers larger than the Amazon, crossed by herds of elephants and stegodon and tigers. And for 60,000 years, people lived on it. They hunted there. They buried their dead there. They watched the stars from its mountains. They told stories to their children about its rivers and its shores. Then the ocean came back, and it took everything. This place has a name. Geologists call it Sundaland. It is not a myth. It is not a Plato fable. It is the actual, real, mapped and measured tropical continent that drowned. And by the end of the next 50 minutes, you will know its world the way you know a country you have lived in. Pull up a satellite image of the South China Sea. Then ask the satellite to do something it cannot quite do, to show you the floor, the contour lines underneath the water. There is software that can do this. Bathymetric maps. And the moment you look at one, the geography of Southeast Asia stops being a scatter of islands and becomes something far stranger. The seafloor between Sumatra, Java, Borneo, and the Malay Peninsula is shallow, not abyssal, not deep. In some places 50 meters, in some places 20. There are stretches where, if the planet warmed only slightly differently, you could walk for hundreds of kilometers across what is now ocean and never get your knees wet. This shallow shelf has a name. Geologists call it the Sunda Shelf. It is one of the largest continental shelves in the world. And during the last ice age, when so much of Earth's water was locked up in glaciers 2 kilometers thick over Canada and northern Europe, when the global sea level was 120 meters lower than it is right now, the Sunda Shelf was not a shelf at all. It was dry land, a whole landmass. The geographer Earl Molengraaf, working in the early 20th century, was the first to map it carefully. He drew the rivers, and there were rivers, vast ones. The river that flowed from the highlands of Borneo across what is now the Java Sea was, by some estimates, longer than the Mississippi. It carried more water than any river in Europe. He could trace its channels in the sediment. The map he drew is not science fiction. It is geology. This is what Sundaland was. Not a possibility. A landscape. With coordinates, with watersheds, with a coastline that ran where the open ocean now begins. Borneo, Sumatra, and Java were not islands. They were the high country of one continuous tropical continent, the highlands of a kingdom most maps do not remember. And the strangest part is the timeline, because Sundaland was not a place that disappeared in some forgotten geological epoch hundreds of millions of years ago. It was not a Pangaea fragment lost to the deep past. It existed during the lifetime of our species. While our ancestors painted in the caves of southern France, Sundaland was above water. While the first farmers in the Fertile Crescent were domesticating wheat, the last shores of Sundaland were still going under. We did not just miss it, we almost overlapped with it. By a few breaths of geological time, our civilizations and that continent were close to coexisting. So if it was real, what was it like to stand on it? To stand in central Sundaland 20,000 years ago is to stand in a country no one alive today has ever seen. The light comes through differently. The forest is thicker than anything in modern Borneo, because the climate during the glacial maximum was drier than today. but the central Sunda lowlands held onto moisture. Rivers everywhere. The Molengraaff River, call it the Sunda River, the Great Central Artery, runs east toward what will one day be the South China Sea, but is right now an inland plain. Its tributaries braid across savanna and gallery forest. Its waters are the color of strong tea, stained by the leaves of dipterocarp trees, 130 meters tall. There are animals here that would feel familiar and animals that would not. The Sunda tiger, ancestor of the modern Sumatran tiger, walks these forests, but it is larger than any tiger alive today. Stegodon, a gentle, tusked relative of the modern elephant, moves in small herds across the grasslands. Pygmy stegodons, dwarf island survivors, hold out in the rugged interior. There are wild cattle, tapirs, orangutans across the entire central forest, not just the two relic pockets where they survive in our era. Rhinos, Bornean clouded leopards, birds whose plumage we know only from feathers preserved in cave middens. The climate is cooler than the equatorial humidity tourists feel in Bali today. The glacial period pulled rainfall southward and inland. The interior of the continent is more like a tropical mosaic, patchwork forest and savanna, than the wall of jungle the islands wear in our age. Smoke from natural fires rises from the dry season scrub. There are seasons here in a way the islands no longer experience because there is enough land to make weather of its own. Rivers swell and fall on annual cycles. They cut sandbars where freshwater fish school in stunning numbers. Hominins on the river banks know exactly when the great catfish run because they have been watching the river for generations. The shorelines of Sundaland sit 120 kilometers further out than any modern Indonesian coast. The whole archipelago you have seen on holiday brochures is at this moment the inland highland of one continuous land. And it is warm. It is fertile. It is dense with food. There is a reason the human story keeps returning to this place. Sundaland during the Ice Age was climatically one of the most habitable refuges on Earth, a green island in a glaciated planet. While Europeans were freezing in caves at the southern edge of the ice sheets, while North America was buried under glaciers 1,000 meters thick, the people of Sundaland were hunting in seasonal forests and fishing rivers warm enough to wade into. This is what we are talking about when we say a continent drowned. Not a barren shelf, not a featureless flat. We are talking about a tropical kingdom, fully alive, fully populated, that existed for the entire arc of our species' modern presence in Asia. And the people there were not new arrivals. In 1958, in a cave in northern Borneo, an archaeologist named Tom Harrison lifted a human skull out of the floor. The cave was called Naya. It opens like a great mouth in a limestone hill on what is, in our era, an island. But the hill is not a shore feature. It is an inland mountain, and during the last glacial maximum, it was a peak rising over rolling forest, 300 kilometers from any coast. The skull Harrison lifted from the soil was 40,000 years old, possibly older. It belonged to an anatomically modern human, one of us, buried with care, pigment on the bones, grave goods nearby. We call it the deep skull. 40,000 years. Think about what that means. When that person was alive, the cave paintings of Chauvet in France had not yet been made. The first art workshops of southern Africa were old, but the Lascaux paintings would not exist for another 15,000 years. Sundaland already had funeral rites, already had grief, already had the mind that buries, and it goes back further. In 2017, on the island of Sumatra, in a cave called Lida Ajar, scientists confirmed teeth that belonged to Homo sapiens, to us, dating between 63 and 73,000 years old. That is older than the oldest confirmed modern human remains in Europe by tens of thousands of years. By the time our cousins were inheriting Europe from the Neanderthals, Sundaland had already been ours for 2 ice ages. But it was not only ours. This continent and its outer islands, the ones that always stayed islands, held an entire constellation of human species. On Flores, a small island off the southern Sundaland coast, a tiny species called Homo floresiensis lived alongside us. They were a meter tall. They hunted stegodon with stone tools. They survived on Flores until perhaps 50,000 years ago, possibly later. We do not know if our ancestors and theirs ever met, but the geography says they could have. On Luzon, north of Sundaland, yet another species, Homo luzonensis, was discovered in 2019. Different bones, different proportions, a separate human lineage we did not know existed. And then there are the Denisovans, a ghost species known for years only from a finger bone in Siberia. Their DNA lives in the genomes of modern people from Papua New Guinea, from the Philippines, from across what was once eastern Sundaland and the islands beyond it. The further east you go, the more Denisovan ancestry you find, sometimes up to 5% of the genome. That ancestry came from somewhere. It came from people who lived, loved, and had children with our direct ancestors. Somewhere on or near Sundaland, 2 species of human met, and one of them is now invisible, except in our blood. This is the part the dry textbooks understate. The continent was not a wilderness with a few Stone Age visitors. It was a populated world, multiple species, multiple lineages, tens of thousands of generations. By the time the first wheat was being threshed in Mesopotamia, Sundaland had been continuously inhabited by humans for longer than any landscape in Europe. By the time the first cities were rising on the Tigris, the people of the Sunda highlands had legends about the rivers their grandfathers' grandfathers had crossed. And then those people did something we are still trying to understand. They stepped off the edge of the known world. They got into boats. Or maybe they did not need boats yet, and they crossed an ocean. Look at the map again. Sundaland to the west. To the east of it, beyond a stretch of deep water, water so deep it never dried even at the lowest sea levels, there is another lost continent. Its name is Sahul. It is the name geologists use for the merged landmass of Australia, New Guinea, and Tasmania, which were, during the Ice Age, all one country. Between Sundaland and Sahul lies a region the biologists call Wallacea, a string of deep-water islands that were never connected to either continent, separated by trenches kilometers deep. To get from Sundaland to Sahul, you do not walk. You cross water. Real water. The shortest sea crossings, even at the lowest glacial sea level, are still in the order of 70 to 90 kilometers of open ocean, out of sight of any shore, for the middle of the journey. And we know with absolute certainty that human beings made that crossing. Because Aboriginal Australians have been on Sahul for at least 65,000 years. Some sites, like Majed Bebe in Arnhem Land, push that date earlier still, 65,000 years ago, while Neanderthals still walked Europe, long before agriculture, long before any city. To get there, The people of Sundaland, or their parents, or their grandparents, looked east at a horizon and decided to go. They built something that could float. They loaded it with children, with food, with fire. They paddled or sailed past the visible coast. They paddled past the second visible coast. They watched their continent disappear behind them, and they kept going into water that had no other side they could see on the strength of a rumor of land. This is one of the great moments in the history of our species, and it happened from Sundaland's eastern shore. There may have been more than one crossing. Recent genetic and archaeological work suggests waves of migration over thousands of years. There were almost certainly losses, boats that did not return, but enough made it across that an entire continent, Sahul, was populated by people whose origins lay in the lowlands of Sundaland. We do not know what those boats looked like. The materials, bamboo rafts, dugouts of dipterocarp trunks, hide canoes, do not survive 60,000 years in tropical soil. But we know that whoever built them lived on the shores of Sundaland, knew the tides, knew the monsoon winds, and had enough trust in their own minds to set off into the visible nothing. It is hard to say this without sentimentality, but it is also hard to overstate. The first ocean voyage in human history, the first crossing into a continent we could not see, almost certainly began on a beach that no longer exists. That beach is somewhere down there now, in the dark, under 60 meters of seawater, somewhere off the coast of what we today call Timor or Sulawesi. The people who launched from it changed the world. Their descendants would, 40,000 years later, paint the great rock galleries of Arnhem Land, tend the longest continuously inhabited archaeological landscape on Earth, carry in their songs and in their genes a memory of a homeland on the other side of the water. And while they were doing that, while the first Australians were walking inland into a strange, dry continent, the people who stayed behind on Sundaland itself were about to face a catastrophe that nearly ended our species before any of this could matter. Roughly 74,000 years ago, on the northern edge of Sundaland, a mountain that had been quiet for hundreds of thousands of years began to make sounds nobody alive had ever heard. The mountain is called Toba. Today, what is left of it is a lake, the largest volcanic lake on the planet, sitting on the island of Sumatra. But 74,000 years ago, Toba was not a lake. It was a stratovolcano of unimaginable scale, and on a day or week or month we cannot precisely date, but can see in the geological record with terrible clarity, it erupted. This was not a normal eruption, this was a supereruption, Toba VEI-8, off the top of the standard volcanic explosivity index. It threw between 2,000 and 3,000 cubic kilometers of material into the atmosphere, the largest single volcanic event of the last 2 million years. Ash from Toba blanketed an area larger than Europe. Layers of it can be found today, 15 centimeters thick in the soil of central India, 3,000 kilometers from the source. There are Toba ash beds in the Indian Ocean seabed, in lake cores in East Africa, in glacial ice in Greenland. For the people of Sundaland, and there were people, plenty of people on Sundaland that day, this was the end of one world. The skies blackened. Volcanic winter set in for a decade or more. Average temperatures may have dropped 3 to 5 degrees globally, much more locally. Tropical forest stress is recorded in the pollen records. Megafauna populations crashed. Scientists debated whether Toba caused a population bottleneck in our species, a moment when the global human population dropped to perhaps a few thousand breeding pairs. Some recent studies have softened that hypothesis. The bottleneck may have happened. It may not have been quite so narrow. The exact human consequences are still argued, but what is not argued is that the people on Sundaland survived it. Because we are still here. Because the archaeological record above the Toba ash layer in caves, like Naya and Leda Ajer, continues. Stone tools above the ash. Burials above the ash. Life resumed. Whoever came back to those caves after Toba, whoever crawled up the river valleys when the sky cleared, was the ancestor of every modern person whose blood runs back to Southeast Asia. It is worth pausing on what this means about Sundaland as a place, because for a continent to absorb a supereruption on its northern edge, to lose 10,000 square kilometers to ashfall and pyroclastic flow, and still continue to host human life, Sundaland had to be enormous, and it had to be biodiverse, and it had to have refugia where the sky did not stay dark forever, where some piece of forest pulled through, where some river kept running, where some child kept breathing through the long winter. Sundaland was the place that did that. It had room. It had water. It had its own internal climate buffers. Other parts of the world that depended on a single ecosystem would have been more brittle. The Toba moment is, in a real sense, why Sundaland matters in the human story beyond its own coastline. It was a refuge that did not break. And the people who walked out of it, the people who left Sundaland in waves over the next 30,000 years, going west into mainland Asia, going north toward what would become China and Japan, going east to Sahul, going eventually all the way to the Americas, carried Sundaland's biological inheritance with them. But they did not yet know that the continent they were walking on was on a clock, because while they were rebuilding from Toba, the planet was slowly inhaling. The glaciers were beginning to wake up. The end of Sundaland did not begin with a wave. It began with a temperature. Around 20,000 years ago, somewhere in the high northern hemisphere, the long glacial maximum reached its turning point, which had been delivering slightly less energy to the polar regions for tens of thousands of years because of orbital wobbles, began delivering slightly more. The shift was gentle, the response was not. For about 5,000 years, the global system held. Glaciers calved at a steady rate. Sea levels crept up a few millimeters a year. Forgivable. Survivable. Ancestors of the people we are talking about would have noticed, perhaps, that the river mouth their grandfathers fished was a little wider in their generation, or that an old camp had become a tidal flat. They would not have understood why. The story would have been told as a strange thing the gods were doing. Then, around 14,650 years ago, the system broke. Glaciologists call it Meltwater Pulse 1A. It is one of the most violent climate transitions in the recent geological record. Over a span as short as 400 years, the global sea level rose between 12 and 20 meters. Some studies estimate as much as 5 meters per century. Not 5 centimeters, not 5 inches, 5 meters. The height of a tall room. Per century. For the coastal peoples of Sundaland, this would have been the end of the world inside a single human lifetime. Imagine you are born on a fishing village on the southeastern coast of Sundaland, somewhere on what is now the Java sea floor. As a child, you walk a beach with your mother, and she shows you the place where her own mother taught her to dig for shellfish. By the time you are a young adult, that beach is gone, not retreating gradually. Gone. 10 meters under the surf. The new shore is half a kilometer further inland, against a low rise your grandmother used to point at as the place where she gathered fruit. That rise, in your generation, becomes the new beach. Now, when you are old, that rise is also gone, and the village your children grew up in is being abandoned. Coral has started to grow on the old fish-drying rocks. Salt water has reached the freshwater wells. The well your father dug fills with brine. This was not a single flood. It was wave after wave of permanent inundation, generation after generation, for 2,500 years. Whole river systems were swallowed in centuries. The Mullengraff River, that great central artery of Sundaland, its lower reaches were drowned first, the channel filling with seawater, the gallery forest rotting from the roots up, the freshwater fish vanishing. The river became an estuary, then a bay, then a sea. The fishermen of one generation watched their grandparents' inland farmland become saltwater shallows where dugongs grazed. There were almost certainly catastrophic single events. Storm surges over weakened coasts, tsunamis from underwater landslides as the continental shelf adjusted to the new water load. Sundaland did not die quietly. There would have been weeks where a village went from inhabited to unrecoverable in days. And the people moved. They moved inland. They moved up. They moved into the highlands that, today, are the islands. The highest peaks of central Borneo, of the Barisan Range in Sumatra, of central Java, these became the new coastlines, and then the new edges of the world. Cultural memory of the floods, when finally written down by literate civilizations 7,000 years later, would describe waters that drowned everything, and a remnant who survived on mountaintops. The mathematics of land loss is staggering. Sundaland at its largest is estimated to have covered around 1.5 million square kilometers of dry land, comparable in size to modern India. By 8,000 years ago, almost all of that was underwater. The continent had been more than halved by 12,000 years ago. Halved again by 10,000. The last shoreline stabilized somewhere around 6,000 to 7,000 years ago, when sea levels approached their modern position. 2,500 years of retreat. 800 or 900 human generations watching the home country of their species shrink. There is no historical event that compares. And here is the part that should make your shoulders settle. At the same moment, Sundaland was drowning. In the Fertile Crescent, the very first villages were being built. Jericho, Catalhoyuk. The world's first agriculture was emerging. Civilization, as we like to define it, was being invented. While the Western world was inventing the city, the Eastern world was losing a continent. By 6,000 years ago, what we today call Indonesia and the Malay Peninsula had nearly the shape we know. Borneo had separated from the mainland. Java had separated from Sumatra. The Java Sea, that shallow tropical sea, that is, geologically, only the most recent wet phase of an ancient lowland, was full again. The continent was gone, but it had not vanished from the people. Not yet. The communities living on the new coastlines, in the highlands that had become islands, were the descendants of Sundaland. Their pottery styles, their rituals, their plant cultivars, taro, banana, breadfruit, coconut, represented a continuous tradition reaching back tens of thousands of years on the same landscape, even as the landscape became smaller and smaller around them. They had memories, real, transmitted memories, stories of crossings their grandparents had made on land that was now seafloor, songs about hunting grounds that no longer existed, names for places nobody could visit anymore. Anthropologists who have worked closely with the indigenous peoples of insular Southeast Asia, the Dayak of Borneo, the Batak of Sumatra, communities across the Philippines and eastern Indonesia, describe a recurring theme in oral tradition: a great water, a homeland that was bigger before, mountains that used to be inland, now rimmed by sea, ancestors who came down from a higher country or paddled in from a place no longer there. It would be too easy and too irresponsible to read every flood myth as a literal recording of Meltwater Pulse 1A. Most flood myths are not that. Flood myths arise everywhere, including in landlocked societies. Memory of large floods is not memory of Sundaland. But, and this is where archaeology and oral history tentatively shake hands, the linguistic and cultural patterns of the Austronesian peoples, which spread out of insular Southeast Asia roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years ago, do appear to carry forward elements that are very, very old. The Proto-Austronesian root word for boat, for rice, for ocean voyage, for ancestors' homeland. These words are deep. Their dispersal traces a wave of seafaring peoples who, starting from the Sundaland highlands that had become islands, eventually settled territory from Madagascar to Easter Island. Half the planet. There is a school of thought, and it is a respectable, peer-reviewed school of thought, that the great Austronesian expansion was, at least in part, the demographic shockwave of the Sundaland flooding. People displaced upward and outward by the rising waters. People who, generation by generation, had been forced to be very, very good at the sea. People for whom the ocean was the medium that had taken their homeland, and who responded by mastering it more fully than any other group on Earth. If that is true, and the evidence is suggestive rather than conclusive, then the cultures of Polynesia, Micronesia, the Philippines, the indigenous Malay world, and even pieces of Madagascar are all in some sense the diaspora of Sundaland. The continent is not, in that view, lost. It is dispersed. It is everywhere those people went. The last shores held memory. They held it in language. They held it in song. They held it in the way coastal peoples talked about the deep water, with intimacy, not fear. This is the part that has to be handled carefully, because once you start saying the words, drowned tropical continent, some doors open in the conversation that good evidence will not support, and other doors open that good evidence absolutely does. Writing in the dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, around 360 BCE, describes Atlantis. He places it beyond the Pillars of Heracles, outside the Strait of Gibraltar, in the open Atlantic. He says it was a continent. He says it was tropical, with abundant water and twice-yearly harvests. He says it was destroyed in a day and a night, swallowed by the sea, around 9,000 years before his time. He says very specifically that beyond it lay a true ocean, surrounded by a real, encompassing continent. Almost all serious classical scholars treat the Atlantis story as a deliberate invention by Plato, a moralizing fable about hubris, dressed in the costume of Egyptian priestly knowledge to give it weight There is no archaeological evidence of an Atlantic Ocean continent. There never was one in any human-relevant time frame. Plate tectonics rules it out. But, and here we need to be careful, some details in Plato's description, set aside from his explicit geography, do map oddly onto Sundaland. The tropical climate, the 2 harvests a year, characteristic of an equatorial monsoon zone, the abundance of water, the fact that the place was a continent, not a city, the fact that beyond it lay other islands, and beyond those, a real, encompassing continent. If you misidentify outside the Pillars of Heracles as a directional confusion in long Egyptian transmission of an even older story, the rest of the geography lines up better with Sundaland in the Pacific than with the actual Atlantic Ocean. This is the territory where pseudo-archaeology has had a field day, and we are not going there. The Indonesian geologist Aurelio Santos wrote an entire book in 2005 identifying Sundaland with Atlantis. Most archaeologists are unconvinced. Plato is Plato. He invented the story. But the smaller, more interesting claim survives. Memory of a real submerged continent, somewhere in the human past, could plausibly have circulated in the ancient world for millennia, carried by voyagers, traders, refugees, before being grabbed up by a Greek philosopher and bent into a moral allegory. The Atlantis story does not have to be Sundaland for Sundaland to be the origin of the kind of story Plato eventually told. The shape of the rumor, a tropical kingdom drowned by the sea, was real before it was told. It is not Sundaland that needs Plato. It is Plato, perhaps, who echoed something distantly true. And the truth was not in the Atlantic. It was in a tropical sea, where, even today, sonar finds river channels carved into bedrock, leading nowhere, just stopping at the edge of the modern coast. Which brings us to what is still down there. Modern hydrographic surveys of the Sunda Shelf, work done partly for oil exploration, partly for cable laying, partly out of pure scientific curiosity, have revealed something extraordinary. The fossil river systems Molengraaf drew on paper 100 years ago are real. They are clearly visible in side-scan sonar. The lower stretches of the great Sunda Paleo River, the meanders of its tributaries, the marshes and lagoons that fringed its mouth. They are preserved on the seafloor like a perfectly tilted, perfectly drowned topographic map. Sediment has covered them, but the channels are there. Off the southeast coast of Sumatra, divers and researchers have found rock terraces that look, to some eyes, like artificial structures. Off the coast of Java, several sites of submerged worked stone have been catalogued. Off the Riau Islands, fishermen have, for generations, brought up worked artifacts in their nets. Most of these finds have not been formally excavated. Underwater archaeology in the tropics is brutally difficult. The sediment is deep. The currents are strong. The water is warm enough to dissolve organic remains rapidly. Visibility is often less than 2 meters. The work that has been done is preliminary, scattered, and not particularly funded. There is one site that became famous, or infamous, depending on whom you ask. Gunung Padang in West Java, a megalithic terraced hill, traditionally dated to between 2,000 and 3,000 years old. In 2014, a controversial geological survey by an Indonesian team claimed the hill might overlie much older constructed layers, possibly dating tens of thousands of years into the past. The claim was contested vigorously by the international archaeological community on methodological grounds, and most of the early dates have not held up to scrutiny. The most recent peer-reviewed reassessments suggest the constructed components are much younger, consistent with the conventional megalithic dating. We mention it not to endorse the radical claims, but because it illustrates a real epistemological problem. We do not know, with high confidence, what is buried under the surface of insular Southeast Asia. We have not looked nearly hard enough. The excavation budgets in this region are small relative to the geographical scale. What is almost certain is that there are sites, actual human sites, not Atlantis cities, but real Pleistocene and early Holocene human campsites, preserved under the Java Sea. The shorelines of Sundaland, where almost all of its people would have lived, are now submerged. Standard population modeling suggests there would have been thousands of villages, hundreds of cemeteries, tens of thousands of stone tool scatters, all of them preserved at depths of 20 to 70 meters of seawater, capped by tropical sediment. We have barely scratched it. In the Doggerland of the North Sea, fishermen have been bringing up Mesolithic flint tools and bone harpoons for generations. The same is true on a much larger scale of Sundaland. The tropical climate destroys some materials, but stone is forever. There are tools down there. There are hearths down there. The contemplative fact about Sundaland is that we are not asking whether it had archaeology. We are asking when, in this century or the next, the technology will be cheap enough to find what is sitting in the dark. The continent did not erase its tenants. It buried them. There is a difference. So what are we left with? A continent that existed during the lifetime of our species, twice the size of India, tropical, forested, rich, inhabited continuously for at least 60,000 years, possibly much longer, home to multiple human species, including ours, the launching ground for the colonization of Australia, the crucible that survived a supereruption, drowned generation by generation, over 2,500 years, by the most rapid sea level rise of the late Pleistocene, and gone. Except that it is not gone. Sundaland, in the way that matters most, is still here. Its highlands are the islands tourists visit today. Its descendants are the 500 million people who live on those islands. Its language family, Austronesian, is one of the most widely spread on Earth, from Madagascar in the west to Easter Island in the east, half the circumference of the planet, all of it traceable to a homeland in the Sunda Highlands. Its genes are in roughly 15% of the world's population. Its memory may be embedded in the way coastal peoples across the Western Pacific tell stories about the sea. The diaspora was not a defeat. It was the longest navigation in human history. People who had watched their homeland sink for 80 generations did not retreat from the ocean. They became its first true masters. The Polynesian wayfinders who, 4,000 years later, would navigate by stars and bird flight and ocean swells across the largest empty space on Earth, were the latest carriers of a tradition begun on a Sundaland beach by people who needed to leave because the beach was disappearing. There is a profound continuity here. The people who lost the most land in human history became the people who held the most ocean. This is why the Sundaland story is not a story of loss in the simple sense. It is a story of transformation. The Pleistocene continent that nurtured early humans for tens of thousands of years gave its inheritance to a cultural pattern that, in the end, traveled further than any other. Sundaland died into us, into a 500,000,000 lives, into a language, into a way of looking at the horizon and not being afraid of it. There is one more thing to say. The planet is warming again. Sea levels are rising again, not at the catastrophic rate of Meltwater Pulse 1A, but rising. The most aggressive projections for the next 2 centuries do not approach what happened to Sundaland, but they approach quickly enough to remind us that a coastline is not a permanent thing. A coastline is what the planet is doing this century. Coastal cities today hold most of the human population. The shorelines we have built our civilization on, the deltas, the harbors, the river mouths, sit at exactly the elevation that the ice ages cycle through. 12,000 years ago, those elevations were dry. 12,000 years from now, the planet will choose again, and we will not be consulted. It is worth carrying this with you, the way the descendants of Sundaland carried the memory of their continent, not as despair, as perspective. Our species came of age on a tropical landmass that no longer exists. We told the first stories on shores that are now dark water. We made our first long ocean voyages from beaches that no map records. The ocean we look out on is, in some places, the lid of an entire forgotten country. And the people we are now, the ones who are watching this, in any country, in any city, are continuous with the people on those vanished beaches, in a chain of grandparents and great-grandparents that has not been broken once. Sundaland is not a lost civilization. It is an ancestor. It is a place inside us, the way every birthplace is inside the people who left it. The ocean came back, and it took everything, and the people who lost everything paddled out to meet it, and they kept going. And here we are,